Hi. So, an update about my current thoughts on the situation. Situation being the fears over the COVID-19 alleged pandemic. When I say alleged, there are 170,000 reported deaths globally from that. So, you would assume from that it is some kind of awful pandemic. But in actual fact, we need to look at the wider context and the overall mortality rates, and also consider whether those actual reported deaths of COVID-19 are actually those, and whether we can definitively say, beyond any doubts, and I would say there are a number of reasons I'll come on to in a minute why I have doubts about those overall numbers. But even if we accept that 160,000 roughly may have died from that strain of coronavirus, we have to bear in mind that reportedly over 3 million people will die of pneumonia globally each year. It's a very rough estimate, and that many virologists that I've read studying the current numbers say that it's in line with a very bad flu epidemic, something that does happen every few years anyway. To give you an example, in the United Kingdom at the moment, the current death toll is registered to be a roughly 16,000, 16,500 when I last read it. Just a few years ago, however, we had a particularly bad flu season where up to 50,000 people were reported to have died. That was during the course of several months. And that's over double the current figure that's been reported to have died from the COVID-19 strain of coronavirus. So, double the number had died from a variety of viral infections just a few years ago, but there weren't any reactions to that at that time. Granted, of course, we're still in an organic changing situation. Numbers could still increase. And the argument that many people use is that it's because of the lockdown measures and the self-isolationism that we don't see a much higher figure of that. Well, that rhetoric is certainly given out by many people, and whenever I hear that, my first thoughts are, where are the proof? What is the proof? How can you prove that there's a cause and effect? How do we know that if the measures hadn't been done, that we might have similar numbers? We might have lesser numbers or more. How can we know that? Well, one way that we could know that is by comparing countries that have imposed strong lockdown or shutdown methods and made it mandatory, legally binding people to self-isolation, making gatherings illegal effectively. We can compare countries that have followed those measures compared against a few countries that haven't. Sweden, of course, is the notable example. And in fact, that's a very interesting example. And if you look at their reported death rates of COVID-19 strain of coronavirus, you'll see that they're in the middle range of the European average. There are certainly a few countries worse, notably France, Spain, UK, and Italy, all of which that are employing these stronger measures to try and enforce people distancing more, allegedly to stop the spread of the virus. Well, now that's strange, isn't it? That Sweden, who are not employing such stringent methods, actually have a slightly lower overall reported fatality rate for COVID-19. That's not to say that those rates are necessarily accurate, and indeed, I'll come on to discuss why I don't think they are, for many reasons. But there is an interesting case comparison of Sweden, who have a lower mortality rate reported than other countries who are following this more stringent and enforced social isolation. Now, I'm just going to speak briefly about why I'm concerned about that. I think for the vast majority of us, it's probably not such a big concern in the short term. It's an annoyance, it's an irritation at most, perhaps. It's led to frustration and boredom. We can't go out and see the friends, go to cafes. People might miss their weekly support group meetings, the social gatherings, whether that's going to church, synagogue, temples, mosques, to the community centre, going out to their weekly trip to a cinema, to an art exhibition or gallery. These things, as socially good as they are and as nice as we enjoy them, over a short time are not absolutely essential things. We all know from our own experience we can cope more or less without them. We might not be as perhaps happy as we could have been, but we can certainly cope many weeks and perhaps months without any serious detrimental effect to our health. We probably have done that in the past. Anyone that's had a long-term injury, for example, or a mental or physical health disorder that may have meant that they were segregated for many months. And our experiences are generally that although we struggle with some issues, frustrations and boredoms, annoyances, it may lead to petty grievances and arguments with housemates or family, but those experiences won't be so awful. They'll be moderate at most. So for the vast majority of people, these measures don't have a serious short-term consequence. And so following them doesn't seem to be that bad. It's not that detrimental to the vast majority of us. And indeed, it isn't to me. I may have had some boredom and frustration, but I haven't had anything that awful happen to me. So I haven't got any real legitimate right to complain that much about the measures, especially if there is any real justification, if they are really helping. Then what real short-term losses are there to a vast majority of us? Perhaps little to none, And indeed, there may be some real positive things to gain from that, spending time away from the world, more time for self-reflection, perhaps more time for artistic pursuits and hobbies, more time for those that have belief for prayer, or for others for meditation, for yoga exercises, for a great many other things, for cleaning the house. But I'm not quite sure I've been that self-disciplined myself in doing those things. But it has led to some time alone and how we choose to spend that time, what media we choose to consume, what activities within our homes, what exercises we choose to do while going out. Those things are negligible, and we can negotiate how positive or negative they might be in the short term. But what I would say is that in the short term, there may be some people, however, that might be experiencing a much harder time. There may be people that have had long-term psychosocial problems that are actually much more dependent, therefore, on those social networks and may struggle much more. People with challenging behaviour. It could be people with learning difficulties. Could be people who are single parents or with lots of children to look after, or that have already stressful lives and with ever stressful situations could actually be under a lot more pressure than most of us are. So it could be that some people are feeling the short-term effects of that much more than others. So it's all very well for some of us to say, okay, it's not so bad for us. And perhaps it's not. Perhaps the burden on us is not so great as perhaps on other people. So we do need to be more considerate about how the short-term measures can affect people in widely differing positions within their lives. Consider somebody who's in a situation of domestic abuse, and perhaps they're living with someone who may be prone to anger issues. Consider someone who's prone to addictions and the risk factors for them. Someone who's got a load of children to look after. There could be a single parent, and they're having to do that while the children are not at school, potentially. Large members of a family that may have difficult issues, being forced and cooped up, living together for long periods. What will the result be for that? So there may be some at-risk groups that may be struggling much more than others during the short-term isolationism. So I think it's worth bearing in mind how that's affecting them, what methods could be employed to help support other people, from online support through counselling sessions, through telephoning people more, through reaching out to other people. I've been quite touched that some neighbours dropped in some letters offering help and support to do shop runs for people self-isolating. And it's kind of support like that we can all potentially help other people through. And as we look at the potential long-term consequences, there will be, it stands to reason, larger groups of people that might become ever increasingly in at-risk groups as the time goes on. So what you'll find is that very small but sizable amount of people may struggle in the short term, but a much larger group of people with moderate to severe needs will perhaps struggle with a longer term. So all the more important for us to get our heads together, or not as the case may be, but to contemplate and to try and think up various ways that we can help supporting other people in a longer term scenario. But all the more important in the short term as well to question the legitimacy of those long-term measures. Because if we do consider what are the possible consequences in the long term to an ever-increasing larger at-risk group, we could see potentially an increase in self-harm, in homicidal, suicidal tendencies, not for everyone necessarily, but there could be a small at-risk group for that. Think of people with behavioural difficulties, learning difficulties, autism, people with ADHD that suffer more perhaps being cooped up for prolonged periods of time. It may be more worthwhile and necessary for them to have access to going out and exercising if they benefit more from that, or suffer detrimentally if they are prevented from that. So it's really worthwhile considering what are the possible broader long-term consequences if we allowed long-term isolationism and shutdowns. There were many people that were dependent on having some sort of structure from social support, and whilst surviving some months without that might be survivable without it being too detrimental to them, that might be a different thing for them in a more long-term context. So I think there's two questions that we should look at, therefore. If the long-term measures do carry on, then what can we do to help support those people in at-risk groups, to support them as best that we can? And what are the potential risks long-term to society as a whole, but more importantly as well to at-risk groups? The second question is questioning whether or not long-term isolationism and shutdowns, or lockdowns as some countries have, whether that's actually justified by the evidence. And it's quite hard to say, of course, in an ever-changing situation. As it stands at the moment, even with the reported numbers that do sound quite high, but actually in an overall context are not out of proportion for what would be considered a normally bad influenza season. Now, I don't say that to make light of the current situation, not at all, because actually influenza can and is deadly. It kills hundreds of thousands of people each year, in fact. It's a very horrific thing, and it tends to affect people who are already seriously ill with long-term pre-existing health conditions, just in the same way that we're seeing the COVID-19 strain of coronavirus affecting people. An Italian study showed from the ISS, the Italian Institute of Health, in their study, it showed that up to 99.2% of people reported to have the COVID-19 strain already had long-term pre-existing health conditions, the overwhelming majority, over 99% in fact. And that's true with normal influenza too. But I don't want to make light of that. People have been talking about horrific sufferings in hospitals, and indeed influenza itself causes that. I've witnessed somebody struggling with an infection that had COPD, gasping and struggling for breath, in pain in every movement. Every breath was a real struggle. and in a lot of chest pain, feverish, hallucinating, somebody that was passing out, losing consciousness, losing cognitive ability. It's an awful and a hard thing. So I'm not making light of that current situation, but I am saying that awful suffering like that presents itself also in other infectious diseases that can cause just as much suffering, heartache to families, and also can be quite deadly, and kill hundreds of thousands of people globally. Now, at the moment, we don't know where the current rates will go, whether they'll continue increasing. Virologists that I've studied, there's consensus in the many that I've studied at the moment seems to be that there's probably a much higher rate, in fact, of the COVID-19 coronavirus. But that may sound quite scary to some people, that there's probably vast numbers of people untested out there that have got the strain or have had the strain. But it shouldn't be that concerning because, like I said, the vast majority of people with fairly strong immune systems are quite capable of getting over that. The overwhelming majority, in fact. So you'll find, that the vast majority of people that contract the disease will be quite capable of getting over it. So even though there will be larger numbers that have it, the vast majority of those will actually be able to get over it fine. And in fact, the numbers of people reported to have it do tend to show a higher mortality rate because people that are struggling with it more and have a chronic condition are much more likely to report that condition and to be tested therefore. So as well as the overall figures tending to show a lesser number of people with the overall viral infection, they tend to also possibly reflect a much higher mortality rate because the mortality rates are skewed if we are more likely to be testing people that are already suffering and going through a hard time and whose lives are threatened and go to a hospital or a doctor to perhaps be tested. Someone who has mild to moderate symptoms is much more likely to get over it and not be tested and not registered as having the COVID-19 strain, therefore. So that's another thing to contemplate and to consider as well. But I wanted to come on and just mention briefly the reasons that I had my doubts about all of the numbers, the reported actual cases of COVID-19. Well, advice being given to doctors here continues to be that just the mere presumption of COVID-19 can be registered as an actual death of that. And that's the advice that's been given out to all UK doctors here. And that only now, according to new legislation, only one GP needs to register the death rather than two, as has been customary. And that was so that another doctor could assess the situation, double checking it. So having a look and seeing if that original diagnosis was correct. But the secondary diagnosis has now been removed. So a solitary doctor can make that recommendation. And the advice given to those doctors is that the mere presumption of COVID-19 is enough to make an actual recording of an actual death, even if the symptoms seem to be that. But given that the symptoms of COVID-19 is so strikingly similar to many other respiratory diseases, might it not be a risk then that so many potentially other viral infections that are not that could in fact end up being labelled as that? And in fact, the CDC itself in America, they are also giving out similar advice at the moment, where they are saying that you could register it as being something that is an actual death, even when it's presumed. And I'm going to quote here one of the CDC's recommendations from their National Vital Statistics Service, it reads as follows. COVID-19 should be reported for all deceased where the disease causes or is presumed to have caused a contribution to the death. And that was dated on the 3rd of April 2020. I'll read that again because I think I may have misread that, sorry. COVID-19 should be reported for all the deceased where the disease has caused or is presumed to have caused or contributed to the death. So it could be just the presumption alone, but one has to ask, how accurate is that? Now, Dr. John Lee, who's a retired professor of pathology, he recently wrote in a column for The Spectator, many UK health spokespersons have been careful to repeatedly say that the numbers quoted in the UK indicate death with the virus, not due to the virus. And I'll repeat that last sentence. The numbers quoted in the UK indicate death with the virus, not due to the virus. A BBC article touched on that same subject, and it reported, what the figures do not tell us is what extent the virus is causing the death. It could be the major cause, a contributory factor, or simply present when they are dying of something else. So even the BBC article admits that although the test may detect that there was some presence of the COVID-19 strain of coronavirus, it does not necessarily therefore tell if it played any part whatsoever, and if it did, what part it played. In a BBC article also recently, an 18-year-old in Coventry tested positive for coronavirus the day before he died, and he was reported as its youngest victim. But the hospital subsequently released a statement saying his death had been due to separate significant health conditions and not connected to the virus. That statement by the hospital was issued on March the 24th. But despite this, many other tabloid newspapers were still referring to him as the youngest coronavirus death a week later on March the 31st. So I don't know to what extent there are false reportings giving really inaccurate pictures of the situation, but that's at least one case. The deaths reported in the UK up to week 13 contained only 0.4% of COVID-19, but that was set to follow during the next few months, the next few weeks, up to roughly, I think, reported 4%, I think, by the following week. But given that the vast majority have serious underlying pre-existing health conditions already, things like bad heart disease, dementia, COPD, serious conditions where one is already prone to viral infections. Viral infections are deadly to people with a number of long-term pre-existing health diseases. So given that the overwhelming majority reported to dying of COVID-19 have those long-term health conditions, and that the testing doesn't prove to what extent the COVID-19 strain plays in the part of the death, and also that presumed deaths can be reported as actual deaths, and also that there are reported cases of false negatives being reported in the testing, where the testing itself is reported to not being perfect and not being infallible, where they have found some people have tested false and then negative and then false again. So there are people coming up with different results, therefore, who have the same condition where it hasn't changed. So we don't know, therefore, how reliable those tests really are and how reliable the figures really are. And yet, despite that, we seem to be basing all this public policy and all these measures that are so widespread, and the effects of those, the consequences could well be severely widespread. In the short term, like I said at the beginning, it may be no more than a real annoyance and a nuisance to many of us, and perhaps the overwhelming majority, as a short-term measure, being out of work for a few months. Many furloughed, at least here in the UK, will have wages met at least. But nevertheless, some in other countries may be struggling economically. But I think the long-term risks are much more concerning, and it's those potential risks that people are looking at. The economic risks for many short-term businesses, for the 20 million people now out of work in America alone. The social risks, for how this will affect widespread society, people being denied relationships. It's all very well saying that I'm all right, Jack, and it's not affecting me. But what about people in more risk groups? What about young children that are not able to see potential parents that they're not living with, or grandparents, or other members of the family? Single parents that will not have that support now for their extended other family. People with serious psychosocial mental health disorders that may be more dependent on support networks than other parts of society. And before you say, oh, well, that doesn't affect me so much, they may well be prone to increased risk of perhaps suicidal and or homicidal tendencies. If only that, for a purely selfish reason, we've all got a vested interest into wanting to protect and to support each other's mental health as much as possible. So the long-term possible consequences are the real concerning issue to me, and unfortunately many other people I can see from online socially are also concerned about this. And I think I'm particularly concerned because I'm reading more and more articles today suggesting that the measures could be rolled out for much more longer term. When it was first started here, we heard about 3 weeks to 3 months. We heard about July as the possible end date. That was the speculation. But as time's gone on, we've started hearing more and more articles suggesting that 12 to 18 months may be necessary, suggesting that some social isolation and some restriction of movement might be necessary for a longer term. And we're starting to see more of these articles proliferate. The BBC have had them, online newspapers have had them, and we're starting to see an increased proliferation where more articles are suggesting much more longer term measures of self-isolationism. And even I think a University of Harvard have sent out various reports suggesting that they feel this is necessary. I've not had time to assess those yet, although it's worthwhile remembering that Sweden, Japan, and maybe not large, but a smallish number of other countries are not necessarily enforcing such draconian measures of such stringent self-isolationism. And they're not doing it for the short term, but some others are at least considering longer term measures. And I think, therefore, it's worthwhile considering what are the longer term risks, not just to society as a whole, but also what are the long-term risks to those that are already in vulnerable, potentially at-risk groups. And I think that is deeply concerning. I personally think that those risks would be absolutely awful. I think if we went into that, it would be one of the most devastating things that we could do. And I actually think shame on those people that are pushing that agenda without properly considering what the risks to society and most importantly to the most vulnerable members of society, especially to children, to single parents, but to parents with less access to support from other people anyway. what risks are to those people suffering from mental health disorders, but also those with long-term physical problems and long-term physical health problems that actually may be lacking access at the moment to healthcare themselves. What with so many cancellations of treatments and appointments, so there's the knock-on effect to so many other people that needs to be considered first before we start embracing or pushing any kind of agenda of long-term isolation. We actually need to consider what are those risk factors to other people in society, and not just consider, oh, I'm okay, I can cope with it fine because I've got the resources. We need to be thinking in a compassionate way, not a Darwinian, oh, the strongest will survive it, it's okay. We need to be thinking about everyone, from the weakest to the strongest, from the little children right up to the elderly people, from the most seriously and critically ill, physically and mentally, to those people that are able and are coping fine with it. We need to be thinking and considering all people when we consider widespread social policies that will have consequences for all of us, because I thought we were all meant to be in it together. But I'm not hearing or seeing some of these social policies even considering what the implications might be for the people in the at-risk groups, and what the potentially dire consequences could potentially be for some people. And that's really sad to see that, actually, to be honest with you. Because actually, I personally feel from my own life experiences that long-term isolationism without proper support for some people going through very stressful situations could well lead, and probably I would estimate will lead, to an increase in many detrimental things, in lots of self-harm, potentially with an increased risk of pathological destructive behaviours. And in the short term, over the next few weeks and potentially month or however long, the risks are only for a minority, and hopefully we can help support those people through that. But if those measures are allowed to go through for months or years even, then those risks could potentially, without proper support, with terrible levels of stress, could be catastrophic. We could see a pandemic of pathological mental health disorders, the like of which we may never have seen before. We could be, in fact,